The wind that swept across the plains carried the scent of dust, sagebrush, and something harder to name. Something Thomas Rennick felt the moment he stepped out of his pickup truck and onto the cracked dirt of his newly purchased property. Wyoming stretched wide and empty around him, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. In the distance, the mountains rose like silent witnesses to everything forgotten here. Thomas had imagined peace, a place where the noise of the city could fall away, where he could rebuild the kind of life he once believed possible before grief rearranged the inside of him. Yet as he walked toward the house, a weather-beaten structure with tired shingles and warped windows, he sensed that silence in Wyoming didn't always mean peace. Sometimes it meant avoidance. The neighbors confirmed that almost immediately. He met the first of them the day after he arrived. A middle-aged rancher named Dale Granger leaned against his fence as Thomas passed on his way to town. Dale's eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat, flicked toward the barn before settling back on Thomas. "You keepin' that place?" Dale asked, not as curiosity but as warning. "That's the plan," Thomas answered with a polite smile. "Got it for a good price." Dale's jaw tightened. "Yeah, there's a reason for that." But when Thomas tried to press him, Dale only muttered something about old stories and letting things lie, before walking off, boots crunching in the gravel as though the conversation itself was dangerous. Other neighbors were the same. A woman at the grocery store paused mid-aisle when she heard where he lived. 2 teenagers stopped laughing as soon as he mentioned the barn. Even the cashier offered an awkward, sympathetic look he couldn't decipher. It was the kind of collective discomfort that didn't happen unless there was a shared memory, one buried so deeply the entire town had learned to tiptoe around it. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because the quiet felt wrong. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the plains outside. Then, just as he began to drift, something broke the night apart. A faint, metallic sound. It came from the barn. Thomas sat up, his pulse knocking sharply against his ribs. He waited, listening. The wind pushed against the house, brushing at the eaves. A loose shutter clicked. But beneath those sounds, beneath the breathing of the old structure, there it was again. A chain shifting, soft, slow, intentional. He forced himself to breathe. The barn was old, full of tools and machinery. Things moved. Wood settled. Metal complained. This was nothing but nerves, he told himself. Nerves and the stories the neighbors refused to tell. Still, when morning came, he found himself unable to ignore the memory of that sound. The sun cast long red beams over the land as he crossed the yard. The barn stood apart from everything else, its boards darkened by age, its roof sagging slightly at the spine. Up close it smelled of dust and animal musk, and underneath that, a subtle bitterness that reminded him of rusted iron. He hesitated, one hand on the heavy sliding door. Then he pushed it open. Light spilled across the interior, revealing forgotten tools, tangled rope, and a tractor that hadn't run in decades. He stepped inside, the wood groaning beneath his boots. His eyes adjusted slowly, tracing the rafters, the dust particles floating like pale insects. Nothing moved, but the feeling moved through him. A pressure, almost like someone's attention. Something waiting. He wandered deeper, studying the floorboards. Some were loose, others warped. One plank near the center of the barn caught his eye. Darker than the others, slightly raised at one corner as though it had been pried open many times before being forced shut again. Thomas knelt, running his fingers along the seam. The wood was colder here, colder than the rest of the barn. He pressed his thumb under the edge and lifted. The plank rose with a long, uneasy sigh of wood. Beneath it, darkness. A narrow space cut into the earth, framed by old beams. The air rising from below felt stale, untouched, almost resentful of his intrusion. A thought crawled slowly through him, something like dread, something like curiosity. Before he could stop himself, Thomas leaned closer, trying to understand what he had just opened. The first glimpse of a hidden chamber. And then, from somewhere deep inside that darkness, a sound drifted upward, so soft he couldn't tell if it was real, or simply the memory of last night echoing back to him. A faint metallic shift, almost expectant. The smell rising from the hidden space was the first thing to unsettle him, an old, compressed dampness, like earth that had absorbed too many secrets. Thomas held the plank aside and let his eyes adjust to the narrow opening. A ladder, its rungs splintered and gray with age, disappeared into the darkness below. Dust clung to it in a soft, opaque layer, untouched for years. And yet, the sound he heard last night still pulsed in the back of his mind. He should have sealed the opening and walked away. He knew that. But the quiet in the barn was too deep, too charged, as though the structure itself was waiting for him to take the next step. He grabbed a flashlight from a nearby workbench. The metal felt icy against his palm despite the warm morning. When he clicked it on, the beam shook slightly. Not from the flashlight, but from his hand. "Just look," he whispered to himself. "Just look, and then decide." The ladder creaked under his weight as he descended, flakes of dried wood cracking off with each movement. The air thickened around him, colder the deeper he went. When his boots touched the packed dirt floor, the beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom and revealed something he was not prepared for. A cell. Not a cage. A cell. The walls were made of stacked stone, rough and uneven, held together with mortar that looked rushed, almost desperate in its uneven strokes. Metal rings were bolted into the wall, their surfaces dull with rust. A heavy chain trailed from one of them, disappearing into the corner where the light struggled to reach. But it was the markings on the walls that froze him. Dozens of them. Scratch marks, some shallow, some deep enough to have broken fingernails. Carved lines, erratic, frantic. And words, though time and dirt had smeared most of them into illegibility. One phrase, however, stood out clearly. "Stay above." Thomas swallowed hard. It felt like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in that single moment. He lifted the flashlight toward the ceiling, noticing the wooden beams overhead. From below, he could see how the plank he had lifted had been deliberately reinforced from the underside. Whoever closed that hatch had wanted it to stay closed. For how long? And for whom? He approached the chain slowly. The links were heavy, the kind that belonged in old ranching operations or on cattle transports. But this chain hadn't been used for livestock. The length was short, too short for an animal unless the intention was cruelty. He crouched and inspected the ground. Something glinted faintly beneath a thin layer of dirt. He brushed his fingers over it and lifted a small metal tag. The engraving had nearly faded, but he could still make out the letters. HH. A name. A set of initials? Holloway. Maybe? He stood abruptly, the thought slamming into him with sudden clarity. The neighbors. Their reactions. The way Dale Granger's gaze had shifted toward the barn with something like guilt. This wasn't just an old structure with a sordid rumor. This cell had held someone. Someone the town preferred to forget. He raised the flashlight again and followed the chain toward the darkest corner. The beam trembled, sliding over dirt, stone, and finally, fabric. A small scrap of cloth, wedged where the wall met the floor. He tugged it free. It disintegrated slightly in his fingers, but not enough to obscure what it once was. Part of a shirt, striped, the style reminiscent of the 1950s. The colors had drained away, leaving only hints of blue and white. Someone had worn this. Someone had lived down here. His breath tightened. He turned slowly, letting the light sweep the chamber once more. Each shadow felt thicker now, weighted with memory. Then he saw it. A second opening. Not large, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was carved into the far wall, half collapsed, half intentional. The dirt around it showed disturbance he couldn't explain, as though something had dragged across it not too long ago. His heart pounded. The chain rattled faintly behind him, not because it moved, but because his imagination pushed sound into the silence. He approached the narrow gap, the beam of the flashlight stretching into its depths. The air that drifted out was colder still, older. It felt like the breath of something that had waited too long to be remembered. Just as he leaned closer, The flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then steadied, but not before he thought he saw, deep in the narrow passage, the suggestion of something reflective. Metal, or eyes. He drew back, pulse thundering. Somewhere above, the barn let out a slow, settling groan, though this time, it sounded almost like footsteps. The ladder seemed steeper on the way up. Thomas climbed quickly, each rung groaning beneath his boots, the beam of the flashlight jittering against the barn walls as he emerged from the darkness below. His breath came harsh and uneven, fogging in the morning air even though it wasn't cold enough for that. He closed the hatch with more force than intended, the wood slapping shut with a hollow thud that echoed through the rafters. For a moment he simply stood there in the barn, absorbing the familiarity of open space, of sunlight, of air that didn't clutch at his throat with the weight of buried history. But even here, in the light, the memory of the underground cell clung to him like a second skin. The neighbors had known. There was no other explanation. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove into town, the unease pressing firmly against his ribs. The main street of Cedar Hollow was small, gas station, feed store, church, and a diner with a flickering open sign, but it carried the stiff, closed-off energy of a place that had built its foundation on shared silence. He pushed open the diner door, the bell above it chiming, and took a seat at the counter. Ada Crowder noticed him immediately. She was older, with pale eyes that had seen too much and chosen even less to forget. Her hands paused mid-wipe on a ceramic mug as she took him in. "You've been to the barn," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas had prepared a dozen ways to approach the subject, none of which seemed useful now. "I found something under the floor," he said quietly. "A chamber, a cell." The diner seemed to still around them. The cook stopped ladling soup. Someone's fork paused halfway to their mouth. The silence tightened like wire. Ada set down the mug slowly, her fingers trembling. "You weren't supposed to go digging down there." "It's my property," Thomas replied. "And someone was kept in that room." Ada closed her eyes as though bracing for something old and painful. When she opened them again, their pale color had sharpened. "You found the chain?" "Among other things." She exhaled through her nose. "Then it's true. All of it." The cook shifted uncomfortably, but didn't interrupt. Whatever truth lay beneath this town, they all carried some piece of it. "Who was down there?" Thomas pressed. Ada's gaze drifted past his shoulder, toward the window where the plains stretched endlessly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Harlan Holloway. H.H. The initials on the metal tag. Ada seemed to read the recognition on his face. "He was the youngest son of Samuel Holloway, the family that owned your property before you. Richest people in the county, respected, feared." "What happened to him?" Thomas asked. She hesitated. The official story was that he ran away. Bad blood. Rebellious boy. Folks said he'd been trouble since he was 10. "And the truth?" Ada looked down at her hands. "Some say Samuel Holloway kept the boy locked away because he was unpredictable. Dangerous, maybe. Others say it was because Harlan wasn't Samuel's son at all, that he was the product of something Samuel needed hidden. But I never believed any version told out loud." Thomas leaned in. "Why not?" "Because I heard him." The words chilled him more than anything she'd said so far. "I was 16, Ada continued. "I worked summers for the Holloways. They had me sweeping the barn one afternoon. It was quiet, except for the wind, always the wind. And then," her voice trembled, "I heard someone crying beneath the floorboards, soft, like they'd learned not to be loud." Thomas swallowed. "Did you tell anyone?" "I told my father." She gave a bitter laugh. "He told me to keep quiet. Told me the Holloways were the kind of people who could bury more than cattle and still sleep at night." Thomas felt heat rising in him, anger, disbelief, something else. "How long was Harlan kept there?" "No one knows," she whispered. "Or if they do, they won't say. What I do know is this. One winter, Samuel Holloway died in his sleep, and the day after his funeral, the chains were gone, the hatch was sealed, and Harlan vanished. The family left Wyoming the following week. and we all pretended the land was just land again. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows, carrying dust across the street in a thin veil. Thomas's pulse quickened. "Ada, I found another passage down there. A narrow one. Looked like someone tried to dig their way out, or deeper." Color drained from her face. Her hand tightened around the counter's edge. "You said the chains were gone," Thomas added. "That means someone took them off. Someone let him out." Ada's voice cracked like old timber. "Or he let himself out." The bell above the diner door chimed sharply as a gust of wind pushed it inward, though no one entered. Ada stared at the door, her expression hollow. "Thomas," she whispered, "you didn't leave that hatch opening, did you?" When Thomas returned home, the sun was already slipping behind the mountains, stretching long shadows over the property. The barn stood in silhouette, hulking, silent, its angles sharpened by dusk. He paused beside his truck, staring at the structure with a new understanding, or something close to it. Whatever had happened beneath that floor, whatever had been confined in the stone cell, was no longer an abstract historical horror. It had a name, a family, a legacy that had seeped into the soil. But Ada's last question haunted him most. "You didn't leave that hatch open, did you?" He was certain he had closed it. He remembered the weight of the wood, the solid thump, the way dust puffed upward as it slammed shut. But memory felt unreliable now, softened by the shock of discovery. He stepped into the house first, checking the locks, checking the stillness. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet the air held a strange tension, as if the walls had listened to something moving through them earlier and were still holding their breath. Eventually, he forced himself toward the barn. The path seemed longer in the dark. His flashlight's beam wavered across the tall grass, catching flecks of dust and insects before settling on the barn door. The wood groaned as he slid it open, the sound too loud for the quiet evening. Inside, the air was heavier, cooler, the kind of coolness that didn't come from weather. The hatch was closed, just as he had left it, but that brought him little comfort. He approached slowly, kneeling beside the wooden plank, brushing dirt from its edges. The cold radiating from the seams had intensified, almost as though the earth beneath had exhaled frost. He hesitated before lifting it again. The ladder waited below, descending into a darkness that seemed thicker than before. He flicked on the flashlight and climbed down, feeling each rung tremble beneath his weight. When he reached the bottom, he swept the beam across the cell. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. The chains lay where they had been. The ragged cloth still rested in the corner. The stone walls held the same carved scars as earlier. But the air carried a faint trace of warmth, almost like body heat lingering in a room just vacated. He turned toward the narrow passage, the unstable tunnel carved into the far wall. Last time he had glimpsed something reflective within. Now as he approached, he noticed something new. The disturbed dirt stretched farther out from the opening, as though something had shuffled or dragged itself closer to the chamber's entrance. He knelt, touching the soil. It crumbled beneath his fingertips, soft instead of compacted like the older layers. Recently moved, but by what? Or by whom? His flashlight trembled, skimming over the small space. He took a deep breath and angled the beam into the passage. The light illuminated jagged stones, roots twisting through the earth, and a narrow curve deeper inside. Then, something caught the light. Not metal, not eyes. A fragment of paper. Thomas reached into the gap, his fingers brushing against the coarse dirt, before finding the scrap. He pulled it out carefully. It was the edge of an old photograph, the surface faded and creased. When he cleared the dirt with his thumb, an image slowly emerged. A young boy, no more than 12, with sharp features and dark, watchful eyes. Harlan Holloway. The boy in the photograph stood in front of the house Thomas now owned. Behind him was the same barn, its boards newer, its paint unchipped. What unsettled Thomas more was the expression, neither smiling nor frightened, but hollow, like someone who had already learned the cost of being noticed. Thomas flipped the photograph. A year was written faintly in pencil, 1953, 20 years before the Holloways fled Wyoming. He pocketed the photo, stood, and turned to survey the chamber once more. His flashlight drifted over the stone wall and froze. New scratches. Faint. Fresh. Vertical marks etched into the mortar near the ladder. They weren't there earlier. He was sure of it. These lines were cleaner, lighter in color, as though the stone dust had not yet fully settled. He stepped closer, heart hammering. The scratches formed 3 straight marks, parallel, deliberate. Not a message, not a word. More like tally marks, a count. He backed away, pulse thickening in his ears. The air around him shifted, a subtle pressure, as though someone had just moved behind him. He spun, flashlight slicing across the darkness. But the chamber was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. Something unseen. Something patient. He climbed the ladder quickly, boots scraping the rungs, emerging into the barn with a rush of breath. He shut the hatch, this time placing a heavy tool chest on top of it. A futile gesture, but it steadied him. As he stepped outside, night had finally taken hold. The wind moved through the grass in slow, deliberate waves. And somewhere behind him, in the barn he had just sealed, something shifted, softly enough to be mistaken for settling wood, unless one had heard it before. The night pressed hard against the windows of the house, thick and unmoving, as though the darkness itself had weight. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the single overhead bulb humming faintly above him. The old photograph of Holloway spread before him like a question he had no language to answer. He kept replaying Ada's warning, her shaken voice, the fear living behind her eyes. Or he let himself out. The land felt different now, charged, expectant, almost listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every brush of wind against the siding sounded deliberate, purposeful, as if the house remembered who had once lived beneath it. Unable to stay inside any longer, Thomas grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the cold. The plains stretched silent under the moonlight. The barn stood in the distance, its silhouette darker than the night around it. He walked toward it with a slow, cautious determination, each footstep sinking into frost-hardened soil. He had come to Wyoming looking for peace. Now he needed answers. The barn door resisted him as if the structure itself disapproved. When it finally slid open, the air that pushed out was colder than it should have been, air that hadn't warmed despite hours sealed under nightfall. The tool chest he'd set on top of the hatch was still in place, but the hatch beneath it sat crooked, tilted, moved. His pulse surged. He stepped forward, grabbed the heavy chest, and dragged it aside. Dust swirled up around him, the air tasting metallic. The wooden plank lay slightly ajar, an inch, maybe less, but enough to feel intentional. Someone had pushed from below. He gripped the edge, lifted the hatch, and let the flashlight beam cut into the opening. The ladder descended into darkness that looked thicker than before, almost alive. He descended once more, the air tightening around him like a throat closing. When his boots hit the dirt floor, he sensed immediately that he was not alone in the space. The chamber felt stirred, as though every particle had shifted position since his last visit. The fresh tally marks on the wall caught the light again, but something new joined them. A sweeping arc scratched beneath the 3 vertical lines. Not a letter. Not a word. A curve. A half circle. Almost like the start of a face. Thomas's breath thinned. He turned the flashlight toward the narrow tunnel. The dirt at the entrance had been disturbed again, this time unmistakably. It had been pushed outward, not inward, as though something had crawled from the passage into the chamber, and stopped, or waited. In the silence he heard something faint, barely audible. Not metal this time, not chains. Breathing, dry, unsteady, somewhere behind him. He spun, but the cell remained empty, the shadows deep and untouched. His hand tightened around the flashlight. He backed toward the ladder, trying to steady his breath, trying not to imagine a boy trapped for years remembering how to be something else entirely. Then his beam caught something on the ground beneath the ladder. Another scrap of cloth, blue and white striped, newer than the one he had found earlier, less decayed. He reached for it slowly. It was warm. The breath he heard behind him deepened, still faint, but real. He climbed the ladder fast, boots slipping against the rungs. When he reached the top, he shoved the hatch closed and leaned his weight on it, chest heaving. The barn felt colder now, as though the night itself had seeped inside. A shadow shifted near the far wall, just a flicker, both too slow and too fast to be imagination. He stepped back toward the open doorway, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Outside, the wind tore across the plains, scattering dust and dead grass. The night stretched wide with nothing visible on the horizon, nothing human. And yet, as he crossed the yard toward the house, he felt eyes on him. Steady, measuring, and not entirely unfamiliar. The land whispered around him, the air carrying a memory long buried. He reached his porch steps when he saw it. A handprint. Small. Pressed into the dirt beside the house. Fresh. He knelt, flashlight trembling over the shape. The fingers were long, thin, almost delicate. Yet the impression was deep, as though made with considerable force. Another handprint appeared farther along the foundation. Then another, leading toward the back of the property, leading toward the tree line where moonlight pooled like silver water. The story the town had buried was no longer beneath the barn. It was walking the land again. And as Thomas rose slowly to his feet, the flashlight dimming as though strangled by the night, he sensed, without seeing, that something waited just beyond the reach of the beam, watching him, remembering him, deciding something about him. The wind paused, the plain stood still, and from the darkness behind the barn came a single, measured exhale. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who loves dark American history, and of course hit the like button to support more stories like this.